God himself chose to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
That's gotta have some value.
Yeah, we have to understand that life sucks.
Yeah.
Like there's suffering always,
Yeah.
and you can do your best to just avoid it. But as
Or
we've also talked about, usually that just leads to more suffering.
right. Or you can embrace it
Yeah.
and you can learn from it
Yep.
and you can grow from it. And I think that's one of the most powerful tools we as people have is failure. Hello and welcome back to Lessons Learned. This is episode 2. I am Dillon,
And I'm Evan.
and we're still talking about maps of meaning. Are we in the second chapter now?
Yes, we're
Yes.
at the beginning of the second chapter.
Okay, so we're just gonna dive right into this episode with the second chapter of maps of meaning. So Evan, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sweet. And just so everyone knows, this is a long chapter, so we'll be in it for a while. It's I don't have the book with me right now, but I think it's like 100 pages or something like that.
Oh wow.
So it'll be a while. So just heads up. But we'll get started. Uh, First quote that I think it's a good one for us. It is therefore the case that our maps of the world contain what might be regarded as two distinct types of information: sensory and affective. It is not enough to know what something is; it is equally necessary to know what it signifies. And then he says it might even be argued that animals and human beings are primarily concerned with the affective or emotional significance of the environment. And that's kind of just how we see the world. And I know that Dylan and I have talked about it before. Um, how we see things, we perceive things according to like their usefulness and stuff like that. It's kind of along those lines, where we don't see the world as only objective objects that just exist, but they also have meaning.
Yeah. So I guess I want to clarify just a little bit because I think I got lost specifically in kind of this the animal's emotional connection.
Hmm.
Is that what it was saying? Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah. Okay. So first, there's the two types of information that there are: the sensory, which is
Mhm.
like the objective stuff, and then there's the affective, which is like the significance. And he says that animals and human beings are primarily concerned with the affective or emotional significance of the environment.
Okay.
So, like, an animal's not focused on that's a tree
Mhm.
or like that's like if it's a tiger,
Mhm.
they don't think about it that way. It's like that is something that will eat me.
Okay, I understand now. So it's like it's not emotional and like, oh, it's so pretty. It's emotional and like this provides me shelter.
Mm-hmm.
This will hurt me. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep. So I thought that was a good starting point. That's one of the major claims he makes.
Mhm.
He talks about this in other places. I wish I remembered the name of what he called the objective world,
Mhm.
but he calls the world of significance, he usually calls that like the narrative world,
Mhm.
where we see things according to like the action that we can do upon them or like the actions that they take and stuff like that,
Gotcha.
because it's more of a narrative. And actually, well, do you have any other questions about that one? Or does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Okay, so the next quote, he does talk about narrative. Um, he says the domain mapped by a functional narrative, one that when enacted produces the results desired, might reasonably be regarded as explored territory, as events that occur there are predictable. And he says that the opposite of that is the unexplored territory. So what he's saying here is that when a narrative that we have about the world is functional, um, then that's the explored territory. That's the territory that we understand.
Mhm.
And he explains it a little bit further in that paragraph in the book. And pretty much what he's talking about is we try to understand things according to how we can understand them. So we try to act according to how we think our actions will affect the world and like what ends those will meet.
Yeah.
Um, and that's our explored territory. And then the unexplored territory is just when something that we don't expect to happen happens.
Okay.
And those are
Gotcha.
kind of the two fundamental places you can be. And that's like what he calls order and chaos,
Mhm.
or at least that's aspects of order and chaos.
Mhm.
Is order is the predictable and chaos is the
The
unpredictable.
unpredictable. Gotcha. Okay. So going back to something you said, in which somebody will say or do something, and basically they will give an input into the environment, and
Hmm.
they pretty much know what the output is going to
Or they
be.
think they know.
Right, at least they think they know.
Yeah.
I mean, generally speaking, we only think we know what's going on. A lot of us um, don't actually know what's going to happen. I mean, you can walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, how you doing?" and like we would expect a response of like, "Oh, not too bad," or something
Hmm.
along that kind of friendly gesture.
Hmm.
But um, I guess my mind kind of goes back to when I was in Cleveland, and there was a lot of like just homeless people or people that were using drugs, and they were the chaos in
Hmm.
this sense because it didn't matter what input you gave them. You were not going to predict that response.
Right.
And I think I've actually about one of my roommates. He was riding. There's a bus that goes from one end of the town area to the other end, and it just loops back.
Hmm.
And you can like as a student, you get a pass. You can get on it and you can ride it down because like my classes were like 10 blocks down from my dorm, right?
Sure.
I never wrote it, but I know my roommate did. And what ended up happening was he's pretty tall like me, and he's kind of got one foot in the aisle of the bus, and he he's just sitting there, no input, right? He's not inputting into the environment at all, and this like cracked out guy bumps into his shoe or something, and
Hmm.
he flips out, and he's like, "Are you trying to kill me?" And my roommate's like, "No." Like
Uh huh.
sorry, like he apologized too. He was like, sorry, like I didn't mean to do that. And the guy got mad and they had to like call the police.
Oh, jeez.
So it's like, there's obviously there's situations like that in your life where
Right.
it's like you don't even have to input and you can just be receiving absolute chaos essentially.
Hmm.
You can be thrown into the unknown and
For sure.
not even have like done anything to be put into the unknown. And
Yeah.
I think that can apply to things outside of that extreme case, you know,
Hmm.
where you I mean you're driving down the road, and I guess you could say you're inputting into the environment because you're driving, but like a deer hits you.
Yeah.
You're being put into chaos. You're being put into the unknown.
For sure.
And I think, there's only so much you can do to try to like train for that. I feel like a lot of people do try to train for that kind of
Hmm.
stuff, but only in those situations are you actually going to be able to go like, "Oh yeah, no, 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 like I'm ready for this."
Yeah. Well, and yeah, so I'm glad you're talking about like other real world
Yeah.
examples of this because he has an example that he uses kind of throughout this first part of the chapter, but
Okay.
I wanted to leave it out to like not invade your
Sure.
ideas that you could come up with.
Yeah. The last thing that comes to mind is like, so if we as people who tend to stray from the unknown because the unknown can be scary and stuff. So if we, out of security and protection and safety, we stray from the unknown, or
Hmm.
we don't try to input things into the environment that could cause an unknown reaction. I The first thing that comes to mind are like soldiers in the military, or firefighters, or police officers, or like even paramedics, like EMT and stuff. Like
Hmm.
all of these first responders, that's all they do is they jump into the unknown all the time.
Yep.
I mean, and your dad
Yeah.
is, facing the unknown every time he's working.
Right.
And it's like,
Because he's a police officer.
right. And it's kind of wild to think about it. Like,
Hmm.
we don't go into the unknown because it's like, oh, like somebody might give me an uncomfortable answer.
Hmm.
But like people like your dad as a police officer, or like people that are like firefighters, and the military, I'd say is the most extreme because they don't know if there's like an IED in the ground that's going to blow their Humvee to kingdom come, or if they're gonna make it to the base wherever they're going if the convoy is going to make it to wherever the objective is, and
Yeah.
they're going to be fine. And like, man, like, hats off to those people in regards to like thinking about it in that sense, because like you're stepping into like some crazy unknown that
Mhm.
most of us wouldn't even do like 1% of that. We wouldn't
Yeah.
walk up to somebody and converse just out of the blue, let alone like go be a police officer and need to handle a situation where you get a phone call. Yeah, somebody's being really aggressive and he's yelling at people, and we don't know what's going
Right.
on. You got to find this guy, and maybe he's in a house and you got to go through this house with no power. And
Mhm.
yeah, like, hats off to those people.
Yeah. Well, and that's why all the police stuff is a huge, like, it's a really tough issue to deal with
Mhm.
because a lot of what people do nowadays is judge it in hindsight
Mhm.
when they know every fact of the case, or maybe they don't know and they think they know.
Right.
But when you're a police officer going into these situations, you have no idea what could be happening, and sometimes you'll find something out and you have a half second to react. And I think that's the case with all of those first responders.
Yeah. Well, you can even break it down to not to rehash old news, but like the Rittenhouse case.
Mm-hmm.
17-year-old is met with two gunmen.
Right.
How would you handle that situation? You as just let's say you just go to college. That's all you do, and you handle normal day situations. You say hi to people, you go to class, you never put any inputs into your environment that could result in an unexpected response.
Right.
And there's a bunch of other topics going on around that situation, but my ultimate point is that, you know, this guy, 17, is put into a situation that is absolutely horrifying,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and he is handling it a lot better than most people would. I know a lot of people would have broken down. Would have started crying. They would have had a panic attack. They would have froze.
Yeah.
There's all these different responses, and I'm sometimes you do have to make difficult situations in order to protect yourself or even your loved ones. But I think the fact that he was so young and he was able to think so cleanly and precisely and take care of the situation in a manner that kept him and those around him alive,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that, that's another hats off situation, especially because he's just, generally speaking, an average guy. I know he was training EMT, but like,
Right.
he wasn't military or police or anything. Like, he was just
Mm-hmm.
training, he was practicing for doing the actual training.
Yeah. And I
So
think you can say all the same stuff about, like, what is it, the Indiana guy in the mall?
yeah, the guy in the mall.
Same thing.
And I think that just goes to show that we should all be striving to be ready for that unknown. They
Definitely.
always say expect the unexpected, but like, how many people walk through life going like, yeah, no, I'm prepared for like a car accident. I'm prepared if this happens. I'm prepared
Mm-hmm.
if there's a shooter. I'm prepared to protect those around me, those I love, in myself.
Mm-hmm. For
I
sure.
I feel like a lot of people, especially in today's society, are kind of missing that in their
I
lives.
think so. And since we're focusing on this quite a bit, I'm gonna skip ahead to where he kind of talks about these things interrupting how you think the world works.
Sure.
Um, so he talks about adaptation to, like, these times where you're thrown into the unknown territory or the
Mhm.
unexplored territory. Um, he kind of sees it as like there can be things that interrupt your perception of what the world's like,
Mhm.
and they can be like trivial things, like a trivial interruption. So like if you're walking along the street, um, and let's say like someone gets in front of you or is really busy or something, and you're trying to get somewhere quickly,
Yeah.
those are trivial interruptions that they're causing a problem at the moment. So you kind of have to change the actions that you're taking to pursue whatever goal you're pursuing. But you don't have to pursue, or you don't have to change like the goal that you're pursuing or anything.
Right. Yeah.
You're just trying. You have to find a different way to it.
Mhm.
So there's those, and he calls those, like, he says they're trivial interruptions, but he calls it like normal adaptation.
Mhm.
Um, where it's those smaller things. But then there's revolutionary adaptation.
Yeah.
And revolutionary is like a much larger scale interruptions and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So here's what he says about the revolutionary adaptation. Um, Simple movement from present to future is occasionally interrupted by a complete breakdown and reformulation, a reconstruction of what the present is and what the future should be. Um, and I like that one. I liked his example that he uses in the book for it. He talks about like if you think you're doing really good at work and you're trying to get a promotion and stuff like that,
Mhm.
and you're being like you're doing everything you can to get that promotion and stuff to be successful,
Mhm.
and then you get called into your boss's office and you're fired because you're not being cooperative with other people,
Mhm.
and all these sorts of things. So you're fired.
Mhm.
That's revolutionary because everything you were doing was working towards that goal, and you thought you understood what was happening. Like you thought you understood your present, and you thought you understood what your future was going to be,
Yeah.
and then all of that's just blown out of the water.
Oh yeah.
And I really think the distinction between those two things is important. Um, yeah. What do you think about that?
I think I feel like there's two ways to kind of attack this. And one pertains to, the situation that we just talked about, first responders,
Mm-hmm.
paramedic, military, all these people, even your average Joe, because it's like, you are one, you're being thrown into the unknown, but two, there is a certain extent in which you can acknowledge that the unknown will cause a revolutionary change in your life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I'm sure for Kyle, Rittenhouse, it was that situation. It's like, oh man, this is the unknown. I've never been shot at.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had to make that decision. Well, how long am I going to wait until I react? How long am I going to withstand being shot at before I make the
Mm-hmm.
decision that my life needs to be a priority here?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's revolutionizing. That change. I mean, we saw it changed his entire life, the whole court case and everything that came of it.
Yeah.
That changed everything. And I'm sure in that moment he wasn't thinking that. He wasn't thinking,
No.
"Oh, this is going to be a life-changing thing." In that moment, he was thinking, "What do I need to do so that I wake up next morning?
Mm-hmm.
What do I need to do so I can see my parents again, so I can see my friends again?"
Right.
He wasn't thinking, "Oh, like, this is going to change my life forever." And and I feel like even just like average person, right? You're driving down the highway 70 miles an hour, deer, boom, and you get into like a bad car accident. You're not thinking, "Oh man, my life has changed forever." You're like, what the heck just happened?
Yep.
What do I need to do to ensure
Mm-hmm.
that my life is preserved? So, I can see mom and dad, or I could see my kids again.
Right.
I can keep pursuing life.
And what Jordan Peterson kind of demonstrates with his example is that person that gets fired, they have a while where they just don't know what to do
Yeah,
because I mean their world fell apart.
yeah,
Like they don't have any goal to act towards or anything like that. So
hmm,
that's where like the depression comes in and all this stuff.
yeah,
And the connection that I thought would be really important to make there is we've talked about at our like youth group thing that we're at a lot about how being in that really low place is where a lot of change can happen, and specifically like that's where you can find God is when you're in that really low spot.
yeah. And that was the next point that came to my mind. Um, was exactly what you said, that low point when you're facing those changes. But I guess I was thinking about it in the same sense of like God, but in a different sense. And from my perspective, where this past summer, I wrote that script for a TV show
Mm-hmm.
because I felt God was like, all right, if you want to change your life, if you want to stop having to go to college and pay all this money for an education that you know isn't you're not gaining anything from it. If you really want to make that step into entering a career that you're super passionate about,
Mm-hmm.
then you need to do this. And I wrote the script
Mm-hmm.
and I sent it over to Daily Wire
Mm-hmm.
and I heard nothing back.
Yeah.
And I felt really confident. I still do feel confident about that situation in regards to that is where I want to work, and I feel that God's pushing me to do work with the Daily Wire.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, I thought I was going to end of summer, midsummer or something. I thought I'd hear back.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to be able to reach them somehow to hear back, and that didn't happen. and I came back to school.
Mm-hmm.
So there
Well,
was
that's where you can question like the is everything I'm doing wrong?
right,
Like, do I have a complete misunderstanding of what I'm
exactly.
experiencing?
And and I think that that was the hardest part for me. And I think that's a large part of like why when I got here, I didn't really do much
Mm-hmm.
and why I was just sitting around. And I was trying not to let just kind of depression set in.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to make sure that I wasn't just sitting around and just going like, man, I suck, life sucks and stuff, because that's not true. And in the Bible it literally talks about God and his plan being beyond your comprehension,
Yep.
and how his creativity is so bountiful. You might be like, oh, God might do this, and then he does like tenfold of what you thought would happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why I'm really excited about this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
is because I think this podcast is going to not just benefit me, it'll benefit you,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll benefit other people. And I think
Yeah.
that's what I'm most excited about, is to hear from other people about how their lives are changing, or how they're able to see and understand things with a new
Mm-hmm.
perspective, or just that in the morning they just like listening to the show, or at night
Right.
they just like listening to the show. And that's what like kind of drives me,
Mm-hmm.
is like I feel good. I feel in my heart that this is good. Even if 20 people listen, that is 20 people that have an enjoyment that we're sharing
Mm-hmm.
with them, that we're creating for them.
And something I don't want to forget about it. So
Hmm.
something that I just thought about with this whole explored and unexplored, and like God's plan's greater than yours.
Yeah.
I wonder how much. I mean, probably it's got to be almost always God operates in the unexplored territory
Oh,
because it's only unexplored for us.
yeah.
Like if God knows like everything, He knows what's in the unexplored territory,
Yeah.
and like I wonder how much He operates in the unexplored territory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, uh, and you could argue that as an omniscient being, he's never in the unexplored territory
Right.
because
Well,
he
for him,
knows
yeah.
everything.
For him, it is explored, but like
But for
it's our
us,
unexplored
yeah.
territory.
So, ah, man, but like in that same sense, you could also argue that he does in fact work in the unexplored territory with us,
Hmm.
because he knows it's unexplored for us. And while he
Right.
knows, he's already explored this territory because of omniscience, but
Hmm.
like at the same time he is working with us
To get
who
through it.
are in the unexplored.
Yeah. Well, which is why I think there's like the Bible quote that like He's a lamp for our feet
Yeah.
because and a light for our path
Yeah.
because in that chaotic darkness, He's the one because He already knows what's out there.
Mhm.
He's the one that can guide us through it.
Yeah. And all the more reason to like listen to God.
Hmm.
You know, all the more reason to do exactly what our youth pastor was talking about last night, which is just have a moment of silence.
Hmm.
Have a moment of silence with God, by
Hmm.
yourself, with no one around you, and just
Listen.
chat with God,
Hmm.
and then listen, and see what he places on your heart, you know, or even just, God, like I'm looking for the next step. What can I do
Hmm.
to see this next step? Can you work through a person? Can you speak to me? Can you give me a sign that's clear so I know what the next step is?
Right.
Because I think that's the hardest thing, is like the unknown. And I think that's why a lot of people are turned away from God, is because it's the unknown,
Hmm.
you know? But man, does the unknown become a lot easier to navigate when you take that step.
Yep.
In I would argue, even if you're like, I don't know about this whole God thing. If you take that step and there is a light at your feet
Hmm.
into the unknown, and you follow that light and you see success, how could you not have more faith than you did before?
Right.
I mean, that's my story. That's what happened to me. I was like, oh man, I don't really know. And then I took that step and I saw the light at my feet, and I went into the unknown, and I successfully navigated the unknown.
Hmm.
And like, it was hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was scary. Yeah. But like, I am here today because of that faith and trust.
Hmm.
So, like, yeah. Wow.
Crazy. Um. Well, I guess let's keep going with the quotes because I think there's less quotes today.
Hmm.
And we went through some of those early ones pretty quick because those were kind of definitional more than anything,
Yeah.
just understanding. Um, but some of these are ones I think that are really easy to dig into.
Okay, cool.
Um, so maybe before I get into the next one, we can really dig in with. I'll get one that last week you were talking about, like the kind of morality or ethics or whatever, or valuation of you going and doing stuff when you wake up in the morning.
Yeah.
Um, this quote just kind of connected that in a
Mhm.
better way in my mind. And he's talking about having a meeting in his analogy of like trying to get promoted and stuff. It's like going to a meeting where you think you'll do good and then you'll get the promotion after the meeting.
Mhm.
So that's the context for the quote. He says, the meeting as sub goal would therefore have the same motivational significance as the goal, although at a lesser intensity, as it is only one part of a large and more important whole.
Yeah.
Which kind of what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, do you understand it?
Yeah, no, like I think that that's pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is basically somebody has accurately articulated something that I've known and been aware of
Mm-hmm.
that I would have otherwise been unable to articulate in
Mm-hmm.
such a extent.
I think that's what Jordan Peterson's very good at
Yeah.
in general, and like that's when I talk to people about him, like especially my mom,
Mhm.
because she's not too into like the whole academia world.
Sure.
She's just a nurse,
Mhm.
and she goes about her day, goes to church, all this kind of stuff. So she doesn't think about these things a lot.
Mhm.
But when I show her Jordan Peterson stuff, she's just like, yeah, that totally makes sense. But I never would have thought about how to
Mhm.
say it like that well or that
Yeah.
concise.
I mean, if if my goal if the goal that I feel God's calling me to,
Mm-hmm.
and the goal, even if it's not something that God calls me to, even if I'm just a fool because I'm bad at listening, you know, that goal that is so important to me, which is working at the Daily Wire, so I can help what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
so I can continue to pursue the goals that they have. Um, if that's the goal, this podcast is just as important to me,
Right.
just as the script is just as important to me.
Mm-hmm.
In a like I said, he's articulating the things that I feel in a like tangible way that people can understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that yeah, that's
Yeah.
about it.
And I think an important clarification there, because you said, it's just important, obviously, to do these other things.
Yeah.
He says lesser intensity.
Mhm.
And to me, that kind of means like the drive
Yeah.
in terms of like, man, that's where I want to be.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean you're any less motivated to do these other things.
Right.
So, like he says, it has the same motivational significance.
Mhm.
So it's just as important. But like that end goal, like, man, that's it.
Yeah, I feel like that's exactly how I feel is, I want to do this podcast for the sake of doing this podcast, but also for the sake of it is I feel that it is one step closer to reaching
Mm-hmm.
the goal.
Mm-hmm.
And
And even if you don't have a full idea of what that goal is going
yeah,
to look like,
no, you don't even, yeah,
because we're only operating off what we know.
right. And maybe there's something different. Maybe there's an end goal that is beyond what I'm seeing
Mm-hmm.
or perceive.
Right. Which is also the importance of following
Yeah.
like God, because He can say, I know you think this is where you're supposed to be.
Mhm.
You're wrong. Like, let me follow me. Let me guide you to where I know you're going to be better.
Don't you love that when you're like running after something so hard and then you kind of take a moment and you're like, God, where am I going? And he's like, well, you're not going in the wrong direction, but it's not like the right direction, and he
Mm-hmm.
kind of nudges you back on that path. I
Yeah.
feel like you kind of experienced that,
Mm-hmm.
going from a history major to law and then back to history.
Yeah.
Like law and history, they can you could argue that they tie in very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
At least in the way you talk about it, it seems to tie very nicely. And I feel like you were on the right path, and then you jumped into law, and God was like, "Well, how about we go
Mm-hmm.
back to history?"
Mm-hmm.
You know?
And yeah, that was more. That was also a something that one of the other youth pastors at our church talked about was the idea that God wants to keep you in maybe like a hallway
Mhm.
where He doesn't have necessarily exact steps that He wants you to take or an exact spot that He wants you to be,
Yeah.
but He wants you to be in this hallway. And
Yeah.
like when you're in the hallway, you have free reign.
Mhm.
You can move around as much as you want.
Yeah.
Um, And I thought that was kind of like it relates to the history versus law idea because I feel like I could do both
Mm-hmm.
and do good things in both,
Sure.
but I feel like I can do more of what I think is important in history.
Yeah. And I would definitely say that, for sure. And I think that's just why you're so great at both of those things. Um, I liked what the pastor said. That was, I in my mind, an important distinction, which is like the hallway is the idea of living like Christ,
Mm-hmm.
living like Jesus and walking like Jesus did,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's important to maintain your maintain your goals within that hallway and not to stray outside of the hallway, because it's just not going to end well.
Yeah.
But
And I think that's a good misconception too that people might have
hmm,
is that following God means you can only do one thing.
yeah, no, 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 no,
Like
no.
there's important things that you do have to stick to, obviously,
Hmm.
but it's like, okay, one of Jordan Peterson's ideas that I really like
Hmm.
is the walled garden.
Yes,
And
we've
I've told
talked
you
about
about this
this.
before, but
Yes.
basically, he says that like society is, or culture is like a walled garden where you have these rules that keep you within it, and they keep bad things out. But when you're following those rules, you're staying within the walls of this garden. You can enjoy the garden. You have free reign to go wherever you want in the garden. You can do
Hmm.
whatever. I think it's the same kind of thing with following God, where it's like you have these rules, yeah, but they're there to keep you safe, and you have a lot of freedom within inside of them, or a lot of freedom in them that's going to make things a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah. And I feel like that's such a not only a great analogy for culture,
Mm-hmm.
but just as you said, God. And I mean, come on, dude. Genesis, the first part of the Bible,
It's
is
in a
talking about
garden.
the Garden
That's
of
where he
Eden.
got the analogy from.
Gotcha. Okay. So it is like a totally biblical reference that
Yeah.
he's making.
Yep.
So, yeah, I just to kind of elaborate that point that like following God isn't a one direction thing. You're not in a Congo line where all the Christians are all going in the same direction. No. Like ultimately the goal is to get to heaven
Mm-hmm.
and to serve God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea, um, and this is going to sound like old news to you, but for me, this was really profound when I first heard it. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've just kind of heard it and grasped the concept recently. Your goal is to serve God. And at first, you're like, why? Like, why would I want to do that? But if you think about the story of the Bible, and even if you're like I don't know about this,
Mm-hmm.
it's like just listen to the story.
Yeah.
So Jesus died for our sins, and Jesus is God's son, and Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit are basically one entity, which is a whole thing that I still, my brain like short circuits.
It's hard to wrap your mind around. Yeah.
um but so let's say, in a sense of trying to ground that idea for the sake of understanding the story, God sent his one and only son
Mm-hmm.
to earth to die for all of us so we could live guilt free of that sin.
Mm-hmm.
He died for our sins. So he died pretty horrifically.
Yeah.
Crucifixion was, it was
The worst.
bad.
It was the worst punishments Romans could come up with.
It was, yeah, it was rough. So, all right. So think about it like this. Even if this guy isn't the son of God,
Mm-hmm.
some guy named Jesus who was incredibly kind to so many people and helped so many people. Even if you're like, he didn't turn water into wine, okay, fine. But he helped so many people, and he brought so much like purpose to people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
He did so much good, and then he said, "I'm going to die for you. I'm a martyr."
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're like not the son of God, he didn't commit miracles. He is still just genuinely one of the kindest people ever to walk this earth. You know, so if you can grasp that concept, that he's that kind, that he died for us, in the sense that he said, I just want you to live like me. I want you to help each other. I want you to love each other. I want you to live happily. I want you to take time in life, take time to rest, work hard, learn from your suffering. If you take all of that, just these tangible, grounded things that you and I could just do,
Mm-hmm.
how could you not want to at least try that,
Yeah.
you know? And going beyond that into where like the thing that I'm trying to get to is like, so you kind of accept that, you live with that, you walk with that, and then you start understanding that that is the truth, and you start believing in God. You start believing in these miracles that Jesus and God have done. You know, you start believing in the stories of Moses parting the Red Sea, which is my favorite story.
Mhm.
But now you're like, man, okay, so God really did send his only son to
Mhm.
die for my sins. He died so that I could live sin free. And the only thing I need to do is believe in God.
Yep.
I want to do more. That's not fair. God does so much for me.
Mhm.
God has helped me. He has saved me. He sent his only
Mhm.
son. You know, for every father that listens, like imagine just sending, you have one son and you send that son
Right.
and he dies for the sake of people. I would want to do so much more than just believing in his message, believing in
Yeah.
him.
Well, and that's a good tie back to the first episode where we were talking about you have to reframe
Mhm.
not just your behavior but what you think is important.
Yeah.
And like when it's something like that, it's not even that hard to change that.
No.
Reframe what you think is important. It's not that hard to
Yeah.
redo.
So the whole idea of serving God, to tie it back to the ultimate point, is serving God
Mhm.
isn't just like a you serve some lord, you serve some guy.
Yeah.
You're serving the guy who is the creator of everything, who sacrificed his only son for you.
Yeah. He didn't have to.
Yeah, he didn't have to. And that's like the big thing is like he is God. He didn't have to do that, but he loved us so much he chose to do that.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I'd want to serve God. And you know what the cool thing about serving God is? It's not you're not just giving everything to him. He's like, "Hey, I have this awesome plan for you.
Yeah.
Do this, work hard, and serve me in the sense that you follow what I call you to do,
Yeah.
and I will keep giving you. I will keep giving to you. A tenfold what you can imagine."
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Mhm.
That's absolutely amazing that
Yeah.
we live in this world that is true,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah, for sure, dude. It's crazy.
It's awesome,
Uh so back to JP.
right?
Um this one I thought would take longer, but looking at it again, I think we have it pretty well understood.
Mhm.
So I'll just let you say whatever you would like to about it if
Sure.
anything stands out. He says, "It appears, therefore, that the image of a goal, a fantasy about the nature of the desired future, conceived of in relationship to a model of the significance of the present, provides much of the framework determining the motivational significance of ongoing current events." Would you like me to tear that apart?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're gonna have to break that one down.
Yeah, so the it was there's that part in parentheses that's in the middle, and that's really what bogs it down.
Yeah.
Um, but so the image of a goal, and a goal, according to Peterson, is a fantasy about the nature of the desired future. So it's kind of
Okay.
what you want from the future.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Um, Conceived of in relationship to a model of the significance of the present.
Okay. Say that one more time.
Well, so pretty much what he's saying is, uh, the goal is a fantasy of what you could have as the future,
Right.
based on what the presence is right now. What the present is right now.
Okay, so like if you're in a low income situation, you fantasize about being out of that and that becomes your goal to be out of that situation by
Sure.
creating some wealth,
And
just
like
for example.
another way that he says it is you can't have, or I think he says that a goal, or like if you're going from A to B,
Mhm.
trying to get to B presupposes that you are currently at A.
Yeah.
So you can't try to get to a desired future
Mhm.
without being in a present right now that you are not satisfied with
Yeah.
in some way or another.
Yeah.
So that's what a goal is. So the image of a goal provides much of the framework determining the motivational significance of ongoing current events.
Okay.
So whatever your goal is, that's what determines the significance of whatever's happening around you at the current moment.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
And a good example of that would be like the we'll take his going to a meeting example and
Mhm.
you're running late or something.
Yeah.
Normally, if you're not running late and you're just walking around, The pedestrians that are in front of you and stuff,
Mhm.
they're just people.
Yeah.
Like they're whatever. You're just walking around. But if you're trying to get to a meeting and you're late, those are suddenly obstacles
Yeah.
when they wouldn't have been otherwise.
Mhm.
So the goal that you're trying to get to is what determines uh, how the things you're experiencing now are perceived by you.
Mhm. And you could also look at it in regards to like the not just the obstacle but the usefulness of a thing.
Hmm.
Um
Definitely.
yeah,
Yeah,
because
that's a big argument he makes in one of his later books.
and that's that usefulness is obviously goal orientated. So if our simple goal is to make a podcast, these gaming headsets that we use to, chat with friends while we play video games, hear the video games so we don't bother everyone else, or just even listening to like music or YouTube videos or
Right.
something. It's a simple thing, and if you were like, oh, how important is that? Like, oh, well, I'd be a little upset if they broke, but like I can just get new ones. But because of this podcast, by the way, for everyone wondering why my audio is worse than Evan's, it is because his gaming headset is much nicer than mine.
Yeah.
But these are now important to us, right?
Hmm.
So if somebody were to come up and break them, we're kind of freaking out, you know?
Yeah.
And I know yours are kind of sort of broken,
Right.
but they're not. They're not
They
them.
work.
They work, exactly. So it's like these have much more value to us
Hmm.
because of this goal, the goal of creating this podcast. And I think we can look at a lot of things, if like the car is the car, if the car breaks, I got to go fix the car.
Hmm.
If the car breaks while you're trying to take your wife who's in labor to the hospital, or if like your buddy broke his arm, you got to get him down the top of the mountain from mountain biking or whatever, that car is very important.
Yeah.
And how dare anything happen to that, because that tool is so vital to the
Hmm.
goal.
Dude, you're setting me up for another quote.
Awesome, perfect.
Uh,
I'm omniscient at this
you
point.
are. Things have no absolutely fixed significance, despite our ability to generalize about their value.
Mhm.
There's like a two-part quote that I like. So I'll go
Okay.
into that first. So obviously what you're talking about is there's no fixed significance to an object. It can
Yes.
change depending on like what's going on or what you think is
Mhm.
important or your goals or whatever. Despite our ability to generalize about their value means he talks about in this section of the book that we can generally recognize things as important
Mhm.
or not. So like food, you
Mhm.
can generalize and say that food, shelter, clothes, electricity, these things are just like important. You can generalize about it,
Mhm.
but the importance of them isn't fixed. So if you if you're in a first world country like ours, food is a lot less significant generally speaking than if you're in say somewhere in Africa where it's a lot less developed and it's a lot harder to get that food. Like we can both recognize that food's obviously important, but our generalization of it is much less significant.
Yeah. And you could even go backwards um in regards to like technology.
Hmm.
So like when you lack food, food becomes vital
Hmm.
because you don't have enough, you barely have enough for survival. So you need to focus on that.
Right.
Whereas for us it's like go to a grocery store. But in the opposite sense, like our phones are, in varying degrees of importance to us, but especially for those of us who like are doing like long distance relationships or have family that are far
Hmm.
away, the phone holds a little bit more importance in regards to being able to get a hold of those people that
Yeah.
we miss.
Yeah.
Whereas in like a place like in Africa where they don't have the food that they really need, it's like I don't care about this phone. I don't care. I don't know what it does. I have nobody to talk to. Everybody that I
Right.
talk to and communicate with to get food, water,
Hmm.
shelter, they're all right. They're right here. I
Yeah.
don't need this.
Yeah. For sure. And actually, something I'm not gonna necessarily assume where Jordan Peterson got these ideas from.
Hmm.
But this sounds a lot like Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Okay.
Have you heard about that?
No, I have no idea what that is.
Epic. Okay, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs pretty much says that there's like this pyramid
Hmm.
of importance. I don't remember all of them anymore because I haven't learned about it since high school.
Oh, I know the pyramid you're talking about, where it's like their foundations like basic things like food, shelter,
Mm-hmm.
water, and then as you go up, it's like things that
It's like
go
more
from
abstract.
yeah, or just like wants
Yeah.
instead of needs. It's like your foundation is your needs,
Mm-hmm.
and then at the top is your wants.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And yeah, I think that that's probably
Mm-hmm.
influencing him somehow.
Sure.
So I pulled it up here. So it start at the bottom is physiological needs.
Yeah.
So that's like the air, food, water,
Yep.
shelter, all that stuff. Um, the very top of that, I don't want to have to go through all of it, but the very top is self-actualization,
Yeah.
which is the desire to become the most that one can be.
Yeah.
And Maslow's point was like, no one's gonna focus on becoming the most that they can be when they need to worry about getting food every single day if they're gonna survive.
Right. And I think that's why stories of like athletes who grew up in like poverty with like just their mom or no parents at all,
Hmm.
they needed to survive.
Yeah.
But not only did they survive, they became the most they could be, and now they're in NFL, NBA,
Hmm.
you know MLB. Like I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind is like the athletes who were nothing, who
Yeah.
needed to survive and did what they needed to survive. But then they took that and they were like, I'm going to work harder so
Right.
I can be the most I can be, so I can accomplish my dreams. And man, is that like a hard thing to do.
Hmm.
But I think a lot of us need to do that. And to some extent, perhaps not just physiological needs, but there's needs we all have,
Right.
and but there's always a goal that we all want, and
Yeah.
that's to be you know successful, and whatever successful means to you.
And
you know
maybe that's a critique that's worth having about the hierarchy of needs
mhm.
is maybe something like self-actualization can motivate you and actually be important to you um, more so than the things like food because obviously you need them
Yeah.
but those wouldn't give you maybe the same drive.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a critique you could have with the hierarchy of needs
Well,
is that
and I would almost argue that I think you're exactly right, because I mean, think about the past couple days as I've been trying to set up our podcast and the distros and create these logos and songs and stuff.
hmm
I just would forget to eat.
yeah.
It was no longer important. Granted, I can definitely lose some weight,
hmm
and
well, and if you're like actually like where food's not an option
right,
then it'll be more important.
right. But I would definitely say that sleep became a secondary thought to getting the logo ready. So,
Hmm.
food became a secondary thought to making our song. These things became secondary thoughts
Yeah,
to the ultimate goal.
I guess I would just be careful not to go too far down that road
Sure.
because like ultimately you still do have access to a bed
Yeah.
and you do have access to food. So
Right.
I think the point is that you don't have to worry about those right now.
No. Right.
You have the ability to focus on something else because you already do have these lower
Yeah.
things on the hierarchy,
Mhm.
whereas someone that doesn't have those things can't spend time focusing on the self-actualization because they don't have that
Right.
lower level need.
Well, I my point is because I've been at the like, oh, where's food gonna come from?
Hmm.
So, and not to the extent that a lot of these athletes have gone, but my ultimate point is like when you're driven to this goal you have,
Hmm.
it can be powerful. I know, like I remember like, oh, I'm hungry, so instead of like trying to find food, I'm just gonna sleep it off. But like I know working, it distracts you just as well.
Hmm.
So I can imagine a lot of these people that are incredibly successful and incredibly strong in character and as well as physically
Yeah.
is because they were like, I'm so hungry, and they found or ate whatever little thing they could, and they were like, well, it's not going to get better, so I'm going to work harder.
Hmm.
And they persevered through the hunger, through the hunger pains, through all these things because that goal was so important to them.
Sure.
And that's kind of where I was taken. I know my situation is a lot less
Yeah.
extreme because I can get food. But my point is like I forget food because of my devotion to my goal.
Right.
So I'm sure that
Yeah. No,
people in different
I do think it helps.
yeah,
Definitely. I wouldn't go too far with that idea,
no, for sure.
is my point.
Yeah.
Um, and I think this is like a really related quote to the one I just gave about the fixed significance.
Mhm.
So we don't really have to talk about this one. unless you think of something you want to say, but I feel like it's pretty self-evident at this point. He said, "It is not possible to finally determine how or whether something is meaningful by observing the objective features of that thing." And I think that's just a good one
Yeah.
to say. I mean, it's pretty much just reiterating the same thing in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, you can't say something is meaningful just by what it is.
Yeah. You can't
So,
judge a book by its cover.
sure.
Something that comes from like pre-K, you
Yeah.
can't judge a book by its cover. Don't just look at the cover of the book, read the back. Da, 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 da.
Mm,
But like, I mean, truly, like, I think you can look at it in regards to like people.
yeah.
You know, as we're told, don't judge a book by its cover. But like, I don't think either one of us would have met each other by just looking at each other. Like, I don't think
Sure.
we would have looked at each other and been like, oh, that's an individual I want to hang out with.
Oh, I mean, I saw you. I saw you face plant on your longboard.
Yeah. And you were
So
like, yikes, that guy's a
I
mess.
was like,
I don't want to go
unfortunate
near
for that dude.
him. Yeah. But it wasn't until, my girlfriend brought us together
Mm-hmm.
and then we kind of hung out and got to know each other that we had a lot in common.
Right.
So,
And then the significance comes in.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that one's pretty simple.
Mhm.
Last quote here. I feel like we can talk about this one for a hot second. So
Yeah.
this will be the last one. We evaluate the significance of ongoing events in light of their perceived relationship to the goal. And that kind of means like we evaluate the significance, like if something's good or bad, or it's useful or not useful, which is kind of what we've been talking about.
Mhm.
And then he says we modify our behavioral outputs, our means, when necessary to make the attainment of our goal ever more likely.
Mhm.
Um, we modify our actions within the game, but accept the rules without questions. We move in a linear direction from present to future.
Mhm.
So each of those sentences, is probably worth talking about.
Yeah.
The first one I think we've gone over. Things are more useful or whatever, depending on your goal. We've
Mhm.
talked about that. Modifying behavioral outputs to make the goal more likely. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So, modifying behavior outputs. Okay. My
Right.
I'm not reading this, guys.
No.
Evan's the one reading
Yeah.
it. So
Evan's
I
the
have to
one
think about
with the
this.
words.
Um, okay. Break this down just a little bit more for me.
Okay. So we modify our behavioral outputs, like what
Mhm.
we do,
Right.
um, to make the attainment of our goal more likely.
Right.
So we
Okay.
change what we do to make that goal that we have happen.
Well, I feel like that goes back to exactly what I was saying.
Hmm.
Is like things that are like needs become second thought to me when I'm trying to achieve a goal.
Yeah.
you know so like getting up and making food is like I'm hungry, but if I stay focused on this, I'm not that hungry.
Yeah.
you know and like you I think you could just go on beyond that. Like discomfort, I would say, becomes more okay when your goal is that important.
Yes, for sure.
And I think that's what drives a lot of people in rather difficult situations,
Hmm.
is like they are discomfort, like they are in discomfort, they are not comfortable at
Yeah.
all. They aren't comfortable, they're hungry, they're tired, they're cold. They might not have access to
Yeah.
a shower. They might not have like parents to kind of look up to, or siblings.
Hmm.
There's people in those situations, but I think that's what makes somebody so freaking successful, is because like rather than focus on the discomfort,
Hmm.
they focus on the goal, and that drive just becomes stronger because the more they focused on the goal
Hmm.
and the more they work towards it, the lesser the discomfort
Yeah. It
becomes.
adds a really clear picture to what you're trying to do.
Mhm.
Because if you know what that goal is, then you work towards it, and everything else can kind of blur out.
Yeah,
Like you get a really
like tunnel vision.
yeah, tunnel vision, exactly, towards what you're doing. Now the danger in that
Mhm.
is that, and I think it's actually something he talks about a little bit in the book. I didn't quote it or anything, but when you get that tunnel vision, it's good to have doubt about what your goal is,
Mhm.
so that you're constantly like rethinking
Yeah.
and verifying that that's like what you should be doing. Because
Mhm.
like in the one with the person that thought they were going to get promoted and they get fired.
Mhm.
That's because they were so focused on the goal that they weren't considering anything else
Right.
that could detract from that. Everything else was just like an annoyance that was getting in the way.
Mhm.
And that can't happen if you want to have a realistic view of the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I have struggled with before in the past and
Mhm.
like worried about like, well, what if I'm going down the wrong path and I'm just convincing myself that what I want to do is what I need to be doing
Mhm.
and that I'm keeping myself like purposefully blind to other things.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with you. I think recently I've been, really worried. Am I listening to God?
Hmm.
Like, am I really following God?
Yeah.
Am I doing the right thing? Am I following the calling He has for me? And something I wrote down in my journal um, from last service, so this past Sunday, was that if God's omnipotent, omniscient, all powerful,
Hmm.
do you really think that when He calls you to do something, that you need to have doubt in that thing? Because if
Hmm.
He wants you to know, you will know.
Yeah.
Was the point I was making in my journal, that you're doubting that He isn't conveying something to you, and that's kind
Mm.
of what relieved a lot of my doubt.
Hmm.
Am I doing the right thing? If if you weren't doing the right thing, you would know.
Sure.
He would tell you. And like I think I've felt strongly about
Hmm.
something I was doing that's the wrong thing. You know. So I'm like, I don't have an ounce of that feeling
Yeah.
present now.
And actually, something from the service that I want to relate to this quote about
Mhm.
modifying our behavior to make the goal more likely is the pastor talked about the idea of free will,
Yeah.
and that because we have free will, um, we have to make wise decisions.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of being critical about what you're doing to make sure that the behaviors that you are changing, that's the thing that will get you towards your goal. And part of that's also listening to God.
Yeah.
Is you can't just like say, "Hey, take the wheel. I'm out of here."
Yeah.
Like you still have to make decisions. So you still have to think about what will be best for you. And like God can guide you towards it, but you still have to be able to make those decisions.
Yeah. And I think that's like a wild misconception that a lot of people have about just being a Christian in general,
Hmm.
is like, oh, well, like God just tells you what to do. Just don't do these things, and then that's it. Your life just floats around. Like, I don't think people take much thought into
Hmm.
like the struggles.
Well, like you can look at Paul. He was tortured and stuff on like everything he was doing for God.
Hmm.
Jesus literally crucified, suffers in the desert with the devil for 40 days and 40 nights. Like there's all these things where people are listening to God and they're suffering,
Yeah.
but they still understand. And like what we've talked about a couple times, that's they understand that that's necessary to get them towards their goal.
Oh yeah. I think suffering is incredibly important. Something that our youth pastor told me was, how good is reward if you've never suffered?
Hmm.
Like, did you did you really earn it? And I took that and ran with it, and I was thinking, from kind of like God's perspective, is He's not going to reward you with something you're not ready for,
Hmm.
because a reward in of itself is going to be the next step for a harder goal.
Sure.
If you're not ready for it, you won't receive that reward. So let's take Daily Wire for example. If my goal is to work for Daily Wire,
Hmm.
and I work really hard and I suffer, it's only through that suffering and hard work that I've learned enough to be put into that fast paced, aggressive, on top of everything
Hmm.
environment,
Sure.
right? Only for the next goal to be beyond that.
Whereas if you're just
Whereas
given
if
it
it's
right
just
away,
handed to me, if
you're
all
not
of a
ready.
yeah, if all
Yeah.
of a sudden, Ben Shapiro emailed me tomorrow and he read my script and he was like, I love it, come work for us. And I get there and I'm not ready, if I can't keep up, I will fail in the reward that I sought so hard for.
Right.
So it's through the
Hmm.
suffering and through that do you really, really learn how to handle your reward essentially. It's kind
Hmm.
of, I think about it almost like buying a motorcycle. You can't start with a massive motorcycle. You don't start with a 1000 cc, 100 horsepower motorcycle.
Yes, or something you can control.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then you learn from that, because you'll still make mistakes.
Right.
Believe you me, you will fall, you'll make mistakes, you'll drop the bike.
Mm-hmm.
So it's only through learning from that can you upgrade the power, can you get a higher reward, because we all want to go fast, right? Everybody that loves a motorcycle, everybody that loves a fast car, we want to go fast,
Mm-hmm.
right? We want to have fun. It's awesome. But if you can't control it at 80 miles an hour, how could you control it at 180 miles an hour? If
Definitely.
you can't control 30 horsepower, how could you control 130 horsepower? How could you, if you can't if you can't persevere through the hardships of setting up a podcast and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
how could you persevere through the hardships of being a director of a TV show for a massive company?
Yeah.
How could you do those things? You
Right.
know?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that can lead to like one of the major takeaways from what we've talked about. I really like his ideas of trivial or normal and revolutionary adaptation.
Mhm.
I think those are hugely important.
Yeah.
And we've both gone through revolutionary adaptation, I would say.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
whether it was through like terrible things happening or like realizations or whatever it is, I think they're absolutely necessary and they're not a bad thing. Like he never says that they're a bad thing. I don't. I think that a lot of the time they're a good thing because it means that whatever conception that you had of the world before the adaptation was wrong.
Mhm.
Like you didn't understand something if a revolutionary adaptation occurs because then you wouldn't need to have that adaptation.
Yeah.
So that's probably my biggest thing from kind of what we talked about today.
Yeah.
And I guess furthermore, when you're led by God in that adaptation, then you can have comfort that it's in the right direction.
Mhm.
Like you know it's in the right direction. Because if you're just guessing based on what you know, like, well, you already messed up once doing that,
Mhm.
so who's to say you're not doing it again?
Yeah. I I think a big tie that I've made in my mind is, um, a lot of people are like, why do we suffer?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why do we suffer? And I think we've both kind of hashed that out.
We've talked about it a lot.
But in a biblical sense, Jesus, the Son of God, God Himself, suffered
Yep.
in the desert
Yeah.
for 40 days and 40 nights
Yeah.
with Satan.
Mm-hmm.
So if the Bible's supposed to be kind of this guide on how to live life and how to do these things and how to
Mm-hmm.
walk with God and understand God, and God Himself chose to suffer,
Mm-hmm.
that's got to have some value.
Yeah. We have to understand that life sucks.
Yeah.
Like there's suffering always,
Yeah.
and you can do your best to just avoid it. But as
Or
we've also talked about, usually that just leads to more suffering.
right. Or you can embrace it
Yeah.
and you can learn from it
Yep.
and you can grow from it. And I think that's one of the most powerful tools we as people have is failure, is
Mm-hmm.
suffering. Because through suffering, through failure, through the perseverance of that,
We can grow stronger.
not only do you grow stronger, your character is way better,
Mm-hmm.
right? Things are humbling. We have so much more knowledge, so much more wisdom, so much more strength. There's so much to be made. I mean, I guess I keep thinking of the expression, forge yourself in fire,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because a forge, like when you forge metal, when you forge a sword, that thing is strong. That is incredibly strong.
Right.
There's videos, if you look at swords, there's videos of guys that demonstrate the strength of their sword by taking a sword, putting it over a pole so they're perpendicular, and they do pull ups with that sword
Yeah.
because of how strong that forged steel is. So, I think of the saying, forge yourself in fire,
Mm-hmm.
because man, oh man, are you going to be crazy strong in so many different ways because of it.
Yes. I agree. I think that's a good takeaway.
Yeah. So that was the last quote.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we've gotten to a good ending point. I think we've tied everything together pretty nicely.
Mm-hmm.
So we're gonna call this episode here. Any last final closing remarks?
I don't think so. There's a lot to go though,
Yeah, I'm
so
excited.
we'll really be able to dive in.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank everybody for listening in and tuning in. Or I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, evening, whatever you're doing. And I cannot wait to have you guys come back for the third episode of Lessons Learned.